Hi there, and welcome to the latest episode of Off the Data Provided, an interpersonal communication podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we're going to focus on dating, relationships, and social media. We'll look at committed romantic relationships as well as exploring the different growth phases of them. But before we delve into that, I wanted to highlight a recent Wall Street Journal article entitled Don't Touch, Don't Go Dutch, and Other Tips for Dating Success. The article offers advice from a professional matchmaker about how to successfully date. So through exploring this article and topic, we'll touch on a few key concepts such as Disney dating, aka the romantic ideal, the rule of three, committed romantic relationships, passion, intimacy, commitment, individuality, invitational communication, explorational communication, intensifying communication, revising communication, communication rules, and relational dialectics. It's a whole lot of communication. And of course, after all of that, we will delve into our Ask Dr. Shepard for the week. And if you'd like to submit your own for Ask Dr. Shepard, please feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. So delving into the Wall Street Journal article, Aliza Ben Shalom first talks to us about Disney dating, and she argues that this is love at first sight that absolves people from the responsibility of being active in love and tricks them into mistaking physical attraction for love. She uses Aladdin as an example. This also reminded me of the concept, the romantic ideal that we talked about earlier in an earlier podcast episode about how foundational romantic tales oftentimes tell us about this unassailable love between a chivalrous king and a lady who has captured his heart. So thinking about the romantic ideal in Disney dating, Shalom offers 4 tips for dating in the current landscape. And while I agree with most of them, her first one is a bit unethical to me. Firstly, she offers that you should date them until you hate them. And while she is not advocating to date someone until you hate them for real, she does advise that you should go on at least 5 dates before you make a decision. And if you still don't know, to keep dating until you do. So she argues, and I agree, that dates are essentially about gathering information. They're fact-finding missions, one might say. And while I agree that you should go on multiple dates before committing, yes or no, I think the rule of 3 is ideal here. So the rule of 3 is that essentially it takes about 3 dates to know if you're into someone, 3 months to figure out if you want to be in a committed romantic relationship with someone, and about 3 years to know if you want to marry someone. To me, after 3 dates, you know if you enjoy someone's company and want to spend more time with them, getting to know them. And if you don't know after 3 dates, odds are you're trying to make someone fit because they're quote unquote good on paper, but the spark, aka passion, that we'll talk about later, is not there. Therefore, you should move on, as not to waste your potential romantic partner's time or honestly yourselves, your own time, right? After this, she offers that you should do quote unquote hands-off dating. With her 3-date, or not 3-date, that's my rule, but with her 5-date rule, she argues you should avoid physical intimacy until after date 5 because introducing it too early can trick you into thinking there's a relationship that doesn't exist yet. She argues that she has seen physical chemistry lead to too many people ignoring red flags or even basic incompatibility because their bodies were already off and running. While I agree that most physical intimacy should be avoided, I think holding hands, hugging, and some kissing are fine within the first 3 dates. I also believe and practice that deeper intimacy should be built towards, as when you have a connection, it makes those things even more intense and pleasurable. Most people, she argues, and I also agree, will be happy to respect your boundaries if you communicate them with kindness and courtesy. And of course, if someone pushes back, this will tell you a lot about who they are or what they're interested in regarding you. And we've talked on an earlier episode regarding sometimes people date you just because they want to become physically intimate with you, not because they're interested in having a committed romantic relationship. Therefore, if you're transparent and upfront about your desires, 1, to have a committed romantic relationship, but 2, to delay a lot of physical intimacy until later, if there's a lot of pushback, this is clearly someone you're probably not compatible with. The article then offers that one should use intentional intimacy. And in this case, it's putting away your phone and being fully present for the date. So removing phones and other distractions then allows you to hopefully engage with your date with great eye contact, asking meaningful questions, and truly being vulnerable in the moment. Azealia offers that a lot of clients seem to assume that it's better to be aloof instead of vulnerable, that they should be playing quote unquote hard to get. She argues, and I also agree with this, that the game of hide and seek may be fun in the short term, but it rarely serves those who are looking for an actual relationship. And I agree here because we know that potential romantic partners who view love as a game are ludus lovers, and they're never usually satisfied. They enjoy the chase, but they're not actually interested in being in the committed romantic relationship. Lastly, this article offers that splitting the bill splits the connection. And she says, call her old-fashioned, but one person should cover the whole bill. Paying for someone communicates your investment in them because you value their time and company. It's a way to bridge the gap between two hopeful, nervous, fact-finding individuals, she states in the article. And while I do agree that investment is super important, and we'll talk about that throughout this podcast when it comes to just interpersonal relationships in general, I do think that when it comes to power and gender dynamics and payment, sometimes this becomes really murky waters. And so, as we've talked about before, communication is context, content, and communicator specific. And therefore, with investment, it can be looked at differently with different parties and is important to figure that out. So for me, I would push back here a little bit and say, I think the first date, maybe even the second date as well, should maybe be Dutch unless you've been fully approached by someone and they want to take you out. But then after that, there should be some meaningful communication about how you each are investing in building this potential romantic relationship. So I know for my ex, for instance, he would travel over 2 hours to come see me, sometimes 4 hours in total in a day, 2 hours here, 2 hours back. And so because there was that level of investment of his time, I didn't mind paying for basically food or any activities that we would do because he was really investing his time. So I think when you have open communication about that, then it can be transparent about how we're both investing. But if it's just someone taking you out all the time, are you truly invested besides maybe you're there instead of on a date with somebody else? And I also think sometimes if we're thinking about breaking free from romance, as we talked about in an earlier podcast, and actually looking for a partnership, it's important to figure out, how do we invest? How are we both investing? And so talking about that, especially early on in a relationship, whether it's a heterosexual, a homosexual relationship, that is going to be key for building and maintaining that relationship. So these are some tips and tricks that this matchmaker offers to get into a potential committed romantic relationship. And so now I want to shift our focus, of course, to what a committed romantic relationship is, right? That is a connection between people who believe that they're primary and a consistent part of one another's lives. They are the I-thou relationships in which we invest heavily of ourselves and in which each person knows that the other is a completely distinct individual. We think about person-centeredness concept here that we've discussed earlier. And so when it comes to committed romantic relationships, whether they're poly or monogamous, they generally involve passion, commitment, and intimacy. And so passion is clearly that intensely positive feeling and desire for another person. It's less central to our experience of love than are the dimensions of intimacy and commitment, as passion ebbs and flows. But passion is going to be especially important at the beginning of a relationship. The honeymoon phase, right, is the period of time where the romantic relationship is filled with both passion, enthusiasm, and newness. Therefore, going back to the rule of 3, if you don't feel that passion within 3 dates, to me, you know deep down that this probably isn't the person for you. And you're trying to make it work maybe due to societal pressures, because someone looks good on paper, or because you believe You guys are compatible, but clearly something is holding that back. So once we get through the passion that ebbs and flows, intimacy is literally just the feeling of connection, closeness, and tenderness. It doesn't have to always be physical intimacy. It can be mental intimacy. It can be emotional intimacy. It can be that self-disclosure where you're sharing things about yourself that other people readily don't know. And then, of course, commitment. Being committed because we find it comfortable and pleasing, sometimes to avoid negative consequences, maybe. Violating religious values, family disapproval, financial hardships is this aspect that comes into play with committed romantic relationships. Sometimes you're with someone just because you don't want to be ostracized. And we've seen that especially with the pandemic. That is still raging with the economic climate that we're still in, that sometimes people stay together just because it's harder financially, or they stay together due to their religious values or family disapproval. But what's also important to note is that commitment, and we'll talk about this later, is not just a feeling. I feel committed. It's actually an action. It's not passive. It's active. So we want to make sure that we're aware of that. And now moving into the growth phases of romantic relationships. Romantic relationships evolve through 3 phases: growth, navigation, and deterioration. So growth has all of these different aspects that I teased before: individuality, invitational communication, explorational communication, intensifying communication, revising communication, and then, of course, commitment. This is the dating phase. This is when you're getting to know someone. This is the talking phase. This is where we pull in that advice from this matchmaker from the Wall Street Journal to consider some of these things. The navigation is when you're actually in a committed romantic relationship. And then deterioration happens when that romantic relationship is ending. We will not delve into deterioration in this episode, but we will explore it on the next episode, as I think it's important to really spotlight deterioration on its own. So getting back into that growth phase, it first starts with individuality. And this is an individual needs to know their own particular needs, goals, love styles, tendencies, and what qualities they look for in a relationship. This is where people talk about, well, what's your love language, your primary or secondary love language? How do you like to be loved? How do you like to be approached? What are your likes? What are your dislikes? You need to know yourself. And so something I took from my father, especially growing up, is he would always tell us that you're not looking for somebody to complete you. You should be a whole individual. You should have your own likes and dislikes, but you should be looking for someone that makes the picture brighter, makes the experience more enjoyable. You should already hopefully be enjoying that experience without that person, but having that person with you makes you enjoy it that much further. Everyone who knows me knows I love a good rom-com, and a lot of rom-coms are built around this idea of you complete me. We don't want that ideally from a romantic relationship. You want someone that adds to you, as Lettucey has a song, How You Gonna Add to Me? That's where you should hopefully be coming from. Of course, we're all works in progress and we're all building and growing. And just because you're a work in progress doesn't mean you shouldn't date or be in a romantic relationship, a committed one at that. But it does mean that you should hopefully know yourself and not look for a relationship to help mold you into who you are. So with that understanding of individuality, we move into the invitational communication phase. And this is where we indicate to another person that we're interested in interacting. So proximity and similarity are major influences on initial attraction in face-to-face relationships. So the term environmental spoiling denotes situations in which proximity breeds maybe ill will. So this is where I talk about, in an earlier episode, someone asked if they were interested in dating someone that they were in classes with. And so I oftentimes talk about, you don't want to eat where you sleep, where you do your business, ideally, because if it goes bad, right, spoils, it will breed ill will throughout that environment. So we know with social media, though, that proximity isn't as important now. More people are open to online dating. More people are open to dating with some distance or even long distance. And so it really broadens up your ability to date. People slide in people's DMs all the time, not knowing necessarily where they are. And this is a form of invitational communication, letting someone know that you're interested in interacting with them, maybe more so than just a platonic or a social media level of engagement. So after invitational communication, we have explorational communication. And so this involves considering the possibilities for a long-term relationship. So you all will be discussing your particular needs, goals, love styles, love languages, what you look for in a relationship. As I said before, you're not looking for someone to complete you, but you're looking for someone to complement or add to you. So this is where you are going on dates. You're doing things. And I often tell people that during this explorational communication phase, this is where you should do things that get you out of your comfort zone, get your partner out of their comfort zone as well. So maybe it's going to the arcade. Maybe it's doing a paint and sip, going to an art museum, doing things you don't readily do. Of course, it's fun to do things you usually do as well, and you should pepper those in. But doing things outside of your comfort zone, outside of the comfort zone of your potential romantic partner, gives you opportunities to see them in a different light and truly, hopefully, see their sincere self. When it comes to explorational communication, we also get this concept of ghosting that we've discussed before. And so ghosting is when one person ends all communication with the other abruptly and unannounced. So ghosting, as I always say, is unethical communication because it undermines your potential relationship and withholds information. So as an ethical communicator, you should be aware that nonverbal communication is often misread. And as I've mentioned before, it's best to avoid mind reading and just ask someone exactly what they're thinking or feeling. If you're not feeling someone anymore, it's perfectly fine to let them know and move on. Ethically, you aren't required, in my opinion, to say why or disclose more after, but saying that you're not interested is ethical and is a way to avoid this concept of ghosting. So just wanted to note that here. So after this explorational phase, you're doing things, you're getting to know one another a little better. This is where you then enter into the intensifying communication phase. This is where you and your partner continue to self-disclose and you begin to create your own relationship culture. So your own relationship culture is going to be guided by communication rules. And these are formed through discussions that become the blueprint for understanding what communication means and what kinds of communication are appropriate, as well as what kinds of communication are inappropriate. So we usually have regulative rules, constitutive rules, and shall not rules. So regulative rules specify when, where, and with whom to talk about certain things. So these are usually partner and context specific. So is it appropriate to talk about your sex life with your close friends, with your parents, with exes? I would probably argue it's probably not appropriate to talk about it with exes and parents, and maybe not with certain friends, maybe only like your close bestest friend. But maybe even depending on who your partner is, they might feel uncomfortable with that. Or if you're having issues in a relationship, is it appropriate to talk to somebody about them or not outside of the relationship? We then also have constitutive rules, and these guide you how to interpret and perform different kinds of communication. So I think about we learn what counts as affection, love, respect, friendliness, flirting. This is important that you and your partner have clear definitions and understandings here because this is where a lot of miscommunication occurs because we assume that we both have the same understanding. We both have the same mindset when it comes to these concepts, and oftentimes we don't. I'm reminded of this famous example. I was at a restaurant, I believe in DC, with my parents and my best friend Janine, and the waitress was clearly flirting with my dad. Right? My mom was paying it dust. My mom could care less. And my friend Janine was like getting upset. Like, I can't believe like she's flirting with your husband right in front of you. And my mom leaned over to her and she was like, I don't care, girl. Right? Like, he's coming home with me. Right? And they had a big laugh. My parents clearly had an understanding of what was, appropriate and what was inappropriate. Clearly, this woman was flirting, maybe probably just part of her job, how she does her job. So my mom was aware of that and didn't take offense. So having conversations, right, that meta communication about communication can help you avoid some of these missteps that happen early on in relationships. And when we aren't truly invested deeply, can take us off the tracks. So if we recall the rule of three, your first 3 dates are probably just that invitational communication and moving into the explorational communication. Now you've survived those 3 dates. So now you're in that 3-month territory, and that's that intensifying communication. And towards the end of that intensifying communication comes the revising communication. And before we get to revising communication, the last rule that you should oftentimes have are shall not rules. And this is what you will or will not tolerate within your relationship and from your partner. These typically don't change depending on who your partner is, but they can evolve and grow as you experience things in your relationships for the first time. So common shall not rules are cheating. Most people, usually, if their partner cheats on them, they're done. It's a wrap. They find out it's over. There's no explanation for the cheating. You've broken that rule. Other shall not rules can vary from flirting, right? Is it appropriate to flirt with someone? Is it not? Things on social media. Is it okay to like people's posts, or is it okay to allow people to slide in your DMs or not? What is or isn't is up to you, as well as your partner. And sometimes our shall not rules don't align, and therefore it means maybe we're just not compatible. So an example of that might be how we communicate. Some people want to be on the phone every day, all day. And if you're not really a phone person, but this other person needs that and requires that, that's fine. It just means that y'all are not compatible. And it's okay. And I talk about compatibility a lot with my students because we oftentimes view dating as, well, somebody did something wrong or somebody did something bad, or I'm just not attracted to that person, or I don't like that person. And it doesn't have to boil down to that. Compatibility can be, we do life differently. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. But what we're looking for is not the same. And so while everything else lines up, it just means we're not going to be a match. So I know for me, I do not want kids. That's a shall not rule for me, right? Essentially, not just boiling down to communication, but just shall not, that's not going to happen. So I've met plenty of people. Everything else seemed to be great. They want kids. Great. We're just not compatible. We have to move on. And so after you've hopefully figured out all of these rules, you've delved into revising communication. So this is where you and or your partner alert one another to the possible problems, dissatisfactions, and evaluate the likelihood of continuing the relationship. So this is where grievances and issues should be aired out formally and figured out before you make a actual commitment. And what's interesting about the revising communication phase is this gets skipped over so often by people. I've seen it happen so many times where you have an issue with your partner, but you don't bring it up, but then you get into a committed romantic relationship. Ultimately, that issue arises and the relationship ends, usually pretty early on. This is something people skip over because they're oftentimes afraid if they address it head on that the person might not want to be in a relationship with them. But I argue you need to show up as your sincere self. Therefore, if you enter into this relationship without grieving out in an ethical and effective way potential issues you have, you're already setting up your relationship to fail. And you're maybe holding on to someone who you're just not compatible with. So after you go through the revising communication phase, ideally you enter into commitment. This is going to be vital for any romantic relationship, and it's the decision to stay in the relationship. During this transactional phase, or transitional phase, I should say, you figure out what your life looks like as a partnership. You make yourself more available to nurture, encourage, and engage the relationship. And so commitment is not a feeling, it's an action. It's active. It's not passive. You are showing up. You are making time. You are having those hard conversations. You are continually engaging with this person. They might get on your nerves. You might take a moment, or you might tell them, hey, I need 10 minutes or I need 5 minutes, but right? This isn't just I feel committed, but I'm going to do all these other things. This is a decision to be in and stay in the relationship. So if you've gone through all of these phases, and as I've said before, during that growth phase of a romantic relationship, most people skip the revising communication phase. But if you've gone through exploring your individuality, engaging in invitational communication, engaging in explorational communication, doing intensifying communication, hopefully doing revising communication, and then entering into a commitment, that then will bring you into navigation. And this is the phase of a relationship where you are working through new problems, revisiting old ones, accommodating changes in both individual and relational lives, and maneuvering relational dialectics. So relational dialectics are opposing tensions that occur in any relationship. The three most common are going to be autonomy versus connection. So being away from each other, autonomy versus connection, being with each other, novelty versus predictability, so doing something familiar versus doing something spontaneous, and openness versus closeness. So clearly being an open book or having some of your own privacy. What happens with these different phases is that sometimes we need to figure out how to manage them. So these three tensions that I highlight, that autonomy versus connection, novelty versus predictability, and openness versus closeness, occur in any interpersonal relationship. We're, of course, focusing on committed romantic relationships right now, but if you think about your friendships, your familial relationships, you probably have to have negotiated these dialectical tensions. So the four common ways that we do that are through neutralization, selection, separation, and reframing. So neutralization is where you strike a compromise, though neither person is fully satisfied. So when I think about autonomy versus connection, being with your partner versus not, you might strike a balance where every other weekend is dedicated solely to be with that person. While they might want to see you every weekend, you also have other interpersonal relationships. Hopefully you're still maintaining and nurturing friendships, your family relationships. You have other passions. You still have a life that was before this relationship. You should still be maintaining that life now that you're in that relationship. We also have selection, where you give priority to one dialectical need and neglect the other one. So if I'm thinking about novelty versus predictability, sometimes couples fall into a rut where they've kind of selected to do the same type of things, the same predictable routine. I know for me, I love a pizza Friday. I have pizza usually every Friday. That's the predictability. How I try and spice it up is trying different places or making my own pizza sometimes. But still, it's kind of prioritized. Fridays, that's what it's going to be. If you're in a relationship and sometimes you're in a rut, you maybe have selected that tension of just doing things that are familiar. And so it might be important to do things that get you out of your comfort zone. Go to an exhibit at a museum that is in town briefly. Go visit arcade. Do something that you and your partner normally don't do. But that selection is giving priority. And so all of us are probably guilty of that when it comes to novelty versus predictability. We usually select predictability, or even autonomy versus connection, especially early on in a relationship. Sometimes people use selection and they prioritize that connection instead of having their own autonomy. The third negotiation of these tensions is separation, where you assign one dialectical need to a certain sphere of interaction and the opposing need to another interaction. So if I'm thinking about food, I love pizza. So maybe my separation is, well, every Friday it's going to be pizza, but we'll do a little spontaneity. We'll try different places for pizza. We'll make our own pizza. That's a good way to figure that out. Or when it comes to autonomy versus connection, okay, maybe weekdays for me and my family and my friends, and then the weekends are usually you and I. But every now and then, if there's a concert or a movie I really want to go to my friends with, because weekends are usually with us together, that'll be something I can do with my friends, right? There's ways to separate that hopefully fulfill each need. And then there's the last one, reframing, which is where you redefine apparently contradictory needs as not being in opposition. So I think of autonomy versus connection with this. I need my autonomy, right? My me time, being away from this relationship in order to show up fully committed, fully engaged, fully active in this relationship. If I'm always with you, then I'm going to have to be on my phone at times because I need to maintain my connections in interpersonal relationships with other people. And that might make you upset. But if I'm able to hang out with my friends, if I'm able to maintain my social life in a way that allows those needs to be met, when I'm with you, my phone can be away. I can fully be present. I can be engaging instead of being half engaged. Or when we think about openness versus closeness, right? Having privacy or being super open, I might reframe that where, yes, there are some things that I don't want to necessarily discuss because I don't feel comfortable. But as we get closer, as we continue to self-disclose, I will continue to open up and there'll be less things that I feel like I need to be private with. Or we can even think about openness versus closeness with separation, where maybe I'm super open to you about what's going on with my friends, but my family drama, I'm going to hold to my chest a little bit. So we can think about these things when it comes to relationships as being really important. And this is going to happen as we know that the navigation phase, right? You're chugging along, not chugging along, and you're revisiting old problems that maybe haven't fully been addressed. You're accommodating changes in who you are as well as who the relationship is. There are going to be new problems as we're growing. And so these relational dialectics are going to be flowing through in and out. And if you have a strong foundation, if you have an openness and willingness to communicate when things hit the fan, then you're going to be able to hopefully navigate the changes in relationships a lot better. And this is where I'll come back to that revising communication. Most people skip this part. And so when it does hit the fan, they don't know what to do because they haven't set those boundaries in place. They haven't set that productive behavior in place. That when I do have a issue or a grievance with you, I don't know how to approach it because I feel like if I do, you might leave. And that's not the reason why you're approaching it. You're approaching it because it's an issue you have. You want to figure out how you and your partner can move forward with that issue, because ultimately, one would argue that you're hopefully in a committed romantic relationship with someone that doesn't want to intentionally harm you. So if they're doing something that's harming you emotionally, mentally, maybe even physically, they will not do that if they ideally are in a committed romantic relationship with you and don't want to do that to you as well. So that is where we're going to stop with the exploring of relationships in dating. We, of course, covered the Wall Street Journal article, which gave us some tips that I, revised a little bit with my rule of 3 and pushed back on a little bit. We explored what a committed romantic relationship should be with passion, intimacy, commitment. We looked at the different growth and navigation phases of relationships, really highlighting individuality, invitational communication, explorational communication, intensifying communication, revising communication, of course, commitment. Then we moved into navigation and how we balance these relational dialectical tensions that we all will and have experienced in any committed romantic relationship, as well as any interpersonal relationship. So that is going to bring us to Ask Dr. Shepard. And this week's Ask Dr. Shepard actually goes somewhat along with what we've talked about. So the Ask Dr. Shepard this week is from, I'll call him Michael. And so Michael asks, I've been following someone on social media, both X or, I call it Twitter, And Instagram, we've interacted and engaged occasionally, but I want to slide in their DMs. How do you think I should go about that? So I think that's a great question, Michael, when it comes to that communication, that explorational communication, or even before that, invitational communication that you're going to try and do. I think if you want to slide in someone's DMs, first, are you both following each other? Because if you are following each other, then your DMs most likely will get to them. If not, they might end up in their inbox where they have to accept. So that's one thing to think about and consider. But secondly, I think if you're interested in sliding in someone's DMs and maybe your pictures aren't really apparent, I know especially on Twitter, a lot of people use a lot of memes and GIFs. And so if you go to their media tab, it's sometimes hard to find a picture of them. If you are trying to slide in someone's DMs, I think you should first, of course, introduce yourself, usually with a picture. I would argue 2 to 3 pictures. One, of course, a headshot so they can see your face, and not a headshot that is super face-tuned and or filtered. Want to see who you are, as well as a full-length picture so they can see a little bit of your style and personality. So that's why I'd say maybe 2 full-length pictures of your style. Of course, say your name, because I know a lot of people on social media platforms use different names maybe publicly. And just start a conversation. Tell them that you've been following them for a while. You're interested in getting to know them more if they are as well, that you hope that they're single, right? Just be open to also them, one, not responding, or two, letting you know that maybe they're not interested, or maybe they're talking to someone, or maybe they're in a relationship. But if you approach it easy, not super intense, but hey, we've been following each other for a while. I think you're a cool individual from what I've seen. I also have found you attractive from the pictures you've shown and would like to get to know you more online and hopefully offline. Introducing yourself with pictures of yourself, your name, and see if they're interested or not. I know, as I've shared before, for some weird reason on Instagram, I've gotten like 1,500 new followers within the last month. I don't know what. I haven't really posted anything, but for whatever reason, I've been inundated with hundreds of DMs, and clearly I don't really engage in them because it's just way too much. But every now and then I'll scroll and see stuff, but it's very weird that people often are like, yo, what's up? Or hard eyes or something. It's like, do you think that's going to start a whole conversation? It's not. You're trying to put the ball in the court potentially, right? So you have to have that invitational communication where you indicate that you're interested in interacting, that show who you are, because this isn't face-to-face communication. And so all of that is going to be super important when thinking about DMing someone or approaching someone online. So that is it for Ask Dr. Shepard. Of course, if you want to submit your own question, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. And I hope to see you on the next one.